I was listening to a Q&A recently, and the topic of how do you prove there is an afterlife came up. The theist, of course, said, well, NDEs, maybe that's proof. And of course, you can research that and look it up, and you see all these doctors and scientists that support this. Which, of course, translates to, I'm not going to support my burden of proof, go Google it. I thought, oh man, again with the NDEs. NDEs have never been shown to be anything significant at all other than something that our brain can apparently do. You honestly think that that's enough to prove an afterlife? Well, apparently so. So I thought, well, maybe something new has been done in the field of NDEs that I'm not aware of. So I'll check it out, I'll Google it, I'll see what has been done. Has there been any metadata studies done on it? Has there been any actual scientific investigation into it that would compel me to think that it's anything more than what the brain does sometimes when people appear to be near death? And the answer to the questions were no, 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 and bleep no. So, metadata study. Couldn't find one. Maybe there is one, just couldn't find it. Okay. Another problem I did find, now there has been some metadata studies done within certain fields of things, but not specifically of NDEs in general. So, at least that I could find on Google Scholar, but, you know, maybe I just didn't spend enough time or look at the right keywords or whatever. But again, I wasn't given any particular link to look at. I was just told to go Google it, so that's what I did. Instead, what I did find is that regarding NDE, there is problem number uno, which many research papers point out this. And that is that it is not well defined. What it is not well defined, so that each research paper then must define for themselves what an NDE even is, or what they would consider an NDE to be. How close to death must it be? And that's a problem. When you don't have a clear-cut, this is what this means out there, then how are you going to study the phenomenon in the first place? So, when that filtering mechanism is applied and said, let's only accept things that have documentation to prove that someone was dead when they claim X, Y, and Z experience happened, what would you then have as a result? What would your sample size look like? But what I found was that wasn't even the case of many of these studies. They were looking at reports made by people after the event happened, by doctors after the event happened. And although the stories sometimes were followed up on years later and the person still had the same story to tell, they didn't ask the doctor years later or the nurse years later. They asked the person that had experienced this thing what their experience had been like. There are some common features in many of these experiences, at least according to one research paper, that then didn't document how many people that they had surveyed or looked at to conclude that these things are common. So it seems to me, on a cursory glance at NDEs, that the research is not very good, to say the least. You have something that's not very well defined, and then you have people basically just making bald assertions without any supporting anything to back it up. You have hearsay. And then you have the ultimate problem for me. If it was true that people were floating out of their body and seeing their operation take place, which is something that one of these research papers detailed, that people were asked about their recovery during some crisis event that happened, and the people that had NDEs were able to say what happened to them with greater accuracy than the ones without NDEs. Okay, so the ones that didn't have NDEs were guessing or speculating at how they were being resuscitated, and the ones that had NDEs had seen it, and that's the only way that they could have known it better. There couldn't be any other causal factors, probably. Not that any of this is actually well documented or anything, because it's all based on hearsay, but whatever. Okay, fair enough. The people are saying that they can see what's going on. Great. Very simple test. Very, very simple test that has not been done at all is simply have a shelf that's above the eye line of the doctors and nurses and EMTs and so on. And on that shelf have like maybe a shelf that has an edge to it, so that whatever's here can't be seen. So here, let me visualize what I'm talking about. So you'd have, say, this object, but it's high up, and I can't see it from down here because this is blocking it, and I don't know what's up here. Only one person that put those objects up on that shelf would know, and that they would then write down what objects they were. They would seal that information and put it in a safe or something. Then if somebody claims to have an NDE and say, oh yeah, I floated up over my body, and they'd say, oh yeah, what'd you see on that shelf there? Because the shelf says, come look up here if you're out of your body, you know? It's plainly written. So, I mean, come on, you didn't see that? Or maybe write it on the floor too, so that if you're floating above the body on the floor, it says, hey, look at the shelf up there while you're out of your body. Oh yeah, I see. Okay, oh yeah. I go and look up and I see the objects, and please memorize these objects for when you come back into your body, so that when we interview you, you can tell us what these objects are. And then that person would simply say what the objects are, and somebody would go up and look and examine the objects and record what the person said before they examined. Actually, they'd record what the person said, both audio and video recording of the person saying the objects are X, Y, and Z. Then the person would go up, a doctor, whoever, somebody would go up and look at what the objects actually are, write that down, and see if they had a complete match, which they should have if they're really doing this. Yet nothing like that has ever been reported. Now, there was and has been a medical place did have a piece of paper attached to the ceiling with writing on it, so that if you were floating into the ceiling, you could peer through the ceiling and read the paper, perhaps. And the shelf idea has been done as well, but neither of these has yielded any result at all. And how do I know that? Well, because it would be huge news. It would be a big deal. It would be Nobel Prize stuff. It would be well known in the scientific community. It would be earth-shaking to have that. But it's just not there. It's just not. What we have are people saying that, yeah, I saw a light, or I felt this, or I felt that, and some of those experiences seem to be common. And all that suggests is that the brain is doing something near death sometimes, but not all the time, which also is a question mark. Why is it that sometimes people experience this, but not every time? Shouldn't it be that if this is really a thing, that everybody experiences it? Why wouldn't some people experience it and others would? What's going on there? Some of these papers say things that make them non-scientific, like, this is inexplicably by natural explanations, which is something that you wouldn't write in a scientific paper. You wouldn't say that there's no way to explain it ever. You would say, you'd say something like, we can't explain it now, or I don't know, or I can't explain it. You wouldn't say that it's completely, you wouldn't write it that way. So although they appear very rigorous research papers on a surface level, when you dig in, you find that they're lacking. Some of them are written by doctors, and some of them are written by scientists. But the peer review, that's the nitty-gritty of it. They don't appear to really have that. So that's a problem too. Look, if you want to believe in an afterlife, okay, fine. I can understand that. It's compelling, it's desirable. But to say that there's proof of it isn't the case. NDEs are not and have not been proof of anything at all, other than that some brains will do certain things around the time of death. And what we mean by death is also flexible and not necessarily well defined, and NDEs aren't well defined, so there's all sorts of problems with it. But of course, ultimately, it's go Google it, because I'm not going to bother doing the research. I don't want to prove my point. I just want to pretend that my point is valid. And when a skeptic comes along to actually do the research and say, yeah, I looked and I found nothing, they'll just go, well, you didn't look hard enough, or you just discounted it because you're whatever, I'd love to believe that it was real, but I have no proof of it. So why hasn't it been done yet? Why hasn't anyone said what's on the shelf yet? That'd be a very simple thing to do. Wouldn't cost that much either. Theists seem to have, some money lying around, at least for organizations of theists, at any rate, churches. Why wouldn't the Catholic Church say, hey, look, we'll fund that. We'll put it in every hospital, every ER that will have it, simple shelf, some objects, controlled conditions. And we'll see if it's real. Because we want to prove it. We want to prove to the world that it's real. Why hasn't anyone done that? Well, it's easy to rely on just second or hand accounts or even first hand accounts. I was like, basically they said I was brain dead, and yet I remember this, that, and the other thing. Well, how do we know that you experienced it at that time and you aren't just remembering it later and thinking that it happened then? Oh, I saw how they resuscitated me. Oh, that's interesting. Did you? And of course, now there has been a couple that were almost interesting. This person saw the serial number on this machine, and they didn't even know that the machine had a serial number, and they pulled it away and they saw the serial number was the same as they said. Unfortunately, nobody had any camera or audio visual equipment of any kind to take any pictures or record that this happened. So it's supposedly an event that happened, and we can't verify it at all. Wonderful. Not good enough. If this was a real phenomenon, wouldn't we have ample evidence of it being a phenomenon? But there's just enough out there that somebody that already believes in an afterlife can say, ooh, NDEs, that proves everything. And they're not going to look into the matter further because they already have a belief about the afterlife that they think this confirms. They don't want to deconfirm their idea. Whereas I would love to know that there is an afterlife. I require, however, a level of evidence that just isn't present for these things. There isn't the sort of thing that one would expect to find in an actual research paper done within scientific methodology. Just people saying that stuff happened. And when they do have something more than what's like, a tunnel of light or feeling detached from their body, when they do have a religious thing, it's every time about a religion that they already know stuff about. It's never about some other religion that they've never heard anything about. So that's kind of weird, isn't it? And it's not always one religion. It's a myriad of religions. Huh. So it doesn't really tell us which afterlife is really real either, even if it's a real thing. Seems maybe it doesn't tell us that there's an afterlife at all, and I think that all it does tell us is that when your brain is deprived of oxygen, it produces these images, or at least you remember it producing those images afterwards. How long afterwards that you were interviewed, who knows, or how long until you say this, I don't know. Is it well documented? Not really. Names aren't taken, recordings aren't made. Maybe you say, well, that's patient confidentiality, but it's like, look, if it happened to you, wouldn't you want it documented accurately, thoroughly? And it never seems to happen to skeptics. That's weird. Oh, well. So NDEs still don't prove anything about anything, except that the brain can do some interesting stuff, and it certainly doesn't prove that there's an afterlife. And far from it being not explainable by natural phenomenon, well, that's just an empty assertion without any proof to that claim at all. How do you know that it's unproven or explainable by natural methodology? Maybe we just haven't invented it yet or figured it out yet. I don't know. Seems like people want or need to believe and then find things that confirm those beliefs. I don't have any belief that I need to hold on to. I would love to find out that there is something to these NDEs, but there just isn't. And if you think there is, provide the cited, peer-reviewed paper that's scientific on it. Not just one thing written by some doctor or scientist. Yes, they can write things that are academic looking, but without the peer review, who cares, right? I mean, they said stuff. Did anyone check? Did anyone verify? Why isn't there more to it than what we have? Why is the demand for evidence so low on this? Shouldn't it be way up high, like the shelf? Why has nobody seen what's on a shelf if they're leaving their body? And why aren't anything being recorded? It's just, there's too many, We should be skeptical without the evidence. But of course, if you have a belief, you don't want to be skeptical because you already believe. So you don't need evidence because you have faith.